In 1993, the release of Mortal Kombat and Night Trap sparked a debate surrounding the impact of violent video games on the young people who play them, and whether or not these games lead to real-world violence. There have been a lot of studies done since then on this issue, and this video aims to talk about how studies show little to no evidence of a link between youth violence and violent video games. The issue of whether or not video games cause violence is relevant to the games industry, as a strong positive correlation between real-life violent acts committed by young people and the consumption of violent video games would no doubt hurt the video game industry's ability to make money. This is because parents of young people that play video games will buy less of a product if it is proven to have adverse effects on their children. This will also decrease investment into the games industry for the same reason, especially given that around 2/3 of video games contain some kind of violence. Firstly, we need to point out that there is a difference between aggression and violence. The Cambridge Dictionary defines aggression as spoken or physical behavior that is threatening or involves harm to someone or something, whereas violence is defined as actions that are intended or likely to hurt people or cause damage. Essentially, all violence is aggression, but not all aggression is violence. This leads to my first point. Violent video games likely cause aggression due to competition between players rather than the violent content of the game itself. A study from the American Psychological Association separated games by competitiveness, difficulty, and pace of play. This study concluded that when you separate games this way, then test gamers on their aggression levels during and after playing each game, the three characteristics listed had a much higher impact on aggression than how violent the game was. If we look at some examples of violent games, like Call of Duty or Fortnite, these games tend to have a highly competitive nature, with players actively trying to kill enemy players repeatedly to win the game. This means that any increase in aggression could be attributed to a want to win over other players, in a similar way playing a sport like soccer or basketball could lead players to show aggression towards other players. My second point is that while exposure to violent video games are a small risk factor of young people committing violent acts, it does not mean that violent video games are a cause of violence. Coming back to the definitions of aggression and violence that I gave before, remember that aggression can lead to violence, but not all aggression is violence. It was found by a 1997 study from the Iowa State University that there is a strong correlation between particularly hot weather and an increase in aggravated assault. Similarly, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found in 2013 that a decrease in people smoking led to a massive decrease in lung cancer patients. A risk factor is not a cause, though. A person can commit assault without the influence of heat, the same way a perfectly healthy person could develop lung cancer. Furthermore, there is no data that has linked violent games and violent crime in the same way heat was linked to assault. If violent games were a strong risk factor of youth violence, we would expect an increase in youth violence alongside an increase in violent video game exposure to young people, although the opposite is true. My third point is that evidence used to support a link between violent criminals and violent video games is either not conclusive or falsified. As previously discussed, increased video game sales over the years have been associated with an overall drop in youth violent crime rates. In addition, a report by the United States Secret Service in 2004 looked at interviews from 41 school shooters from 1974 to 2000. The report found that of the 41 shooters, only 12% of them had any interest in violent video games, compared to 51% that were interested in other violent media such as books and movies. Additionally, previous studies on the link between school shooters in America were noted in the Secret Service report as using falsified or misleading evidence. For example, the gunman behind the Virginia Tech mass shooting was said to be a fan of the game Counter-Strike. It was later found by a government panel aimed at looking into this shooting that the shooter had never owned the game Counter-Strike, which ultimately undermines the credibility of this study and others that were found to use similar evidence. With all of this said, it cannot be denied that studies have shown a link between increases in aggression in young people. A significant portion of these studies are highly credible, including a 2010 study from the American Psychological Association. This study, however, concluded that longer-term studies are needed to find any definitive link between violent video games and youth violence. In addition, 3 separate papers, one from 2000 and 2 from 2009, all found that after a young person had played a violent video game for a short period, they were more likely to exhibit aggressive behavior when compared to a group of young people that had played a non-violent video game. However, these three studies failed to find a definitive method of finding aggression in the youth studied. For example, some of the main methods used to discern whether a youth was more prone to aggression following playing the violent game included whether the youth would blast another person with an air horn, how much hot sauce the youth would put on a taco before giving it to a person who did not like spicy food, and whether or not the youth reported feeling hostile on a questionnaire. These things could all be considered acts of aggression, but they could also be considered light-hearted pranks or jokes. Overall, this shows that studies and news articles linking violent video games to youth violence show little to no evidence of a connection between youth violence and exposure to violent video games.